Well, something I forgot to do, but I always tell you I will do, is that whenever I get a new T-shirt, I let you look at it, because there's some interesting things out. I really appreciate it. I've got a kind of a backlog of T-shirts that have been coming in, so it may take me a while to get through them all. But this one was given to me by my grandson, Hudson, who is on our staff, and he works in the technical department at our church. And what it says basically is one word: inconceivable. If you've watched Princess Bride, you know exactly what this is talking about. Vincenti, the Italian, I don't know, he was basically a tricky man. He was trying to kidnap. Well, I won't go into the story. It takes too long. But anyway, the bottom line is that he was always saying things were inconceivable, inconceivable. And the giant turns to him finally and says, "I don't think you know what that word means," which I think is one of the funniest lines in the whole movie. But anyway, that's what this T-shirt is all about, so we can move on. The last thing that we talked about yesterday was about how that we have eyewitness accounts that verify a narrative, not just simply a story or a fable. That Peter said, we don't follow myths, we follow facts. And that's one of the critical foundation stones of the whole biblical message, is that this is history written in story form. It's a narrative, granted, but it's history. Even the book of Genesis is not written as some kind of mythological fable, because sometimes people try to compare them to some other ancient flood stories and so forth, and their origins of the earth and so forth. But the problem is those stories are so fantastical and unreal. The same way with most of the Gnostic Gospels, we understand why don't we follow the Gnostic Gospels? Because many of the things they teach about Jesus are just more like magic than they are biblical truth. And they have a whole bit different view of Jesus. They don't see Jesus as being God-man. They see him as a man who became God. And there's a very, very big difference, because what the gospel is telling us, because man couldn't reach God, God reached down to man. And he dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as the only begotten of the Father. What Gnosticism and Mormonism and JWs and scores of other false religions teach is that Jesus started as a man and he rose up to Godhead. Well, that's not what the Bible teaches. And certainly what their whole message is, if you follow the same formula that we follow, then we can help you become God as well. And that most people don't realize that's the ultimate goal of, say, Mormonism, is to reach godhood and become the next Adam and plant your own nation, planets, and have your own celestial wives and all that kind of nonsense that they purport to be based upon some kind of fixture. Here's the thing that most people don't realize regarding Mormonism. Do you know that there's not one single doctrine that the Mormon Church teaches that is found in the Book of Mormon? All of their doctrine comes from their later quote-unquote apostles and the things that they wrote. They're not something that was in the Book of Mormon, which is really important, because the Book of Mormon they always refer to as being their scripture, really the thing that kind of fulfills all the answers that people need to have. And the reality is, it's just a really crazy mythological story that was made up back in the 19th century. And suddenly it went from the author's hands, who submitted it to a publisher, and into somebody else's hand who worked for that publisher, and then into the hands of Joseph Smith. At least that's where the train of evidence seems to lead us. But in talking about being eyewitnesses, what were they eyewitnesses of? And Peter said, we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. This word majesty, it's interesting, because one lexicon translated as superbness, his superbness. I didn't even know that was a word until I looked it up. But we beheld his superbness. That means his splendor, his greatness, his power. In a way, another big word that fits in describing this is ineffability. Ineffability means that there's no way to describe it. We don't have anything in our material universe that we can use as an example and a comparative. And so Jesus basically manifested something that had never been seen before in the world and will never be seen again. And this is kind of important for those of you who feel like, if I'm going to get to heaven, I have to become just like Jesus. And that sometimes is not what people intend, but it's what ends up being communicated, like little wristbands that say, what would Jesus do? It's a great question, and something we need to ask ourselves when we're dealing with difficult situations in particular. But what people oftentimes get this idea, I have to behave exactly like Jesus to get saved. And you find out very quickly that you fall short of the glory of God every day in numerous ways. And so it's his grace that saves us. And so we need to dispel that idea that somehow we're going through difficult things because we weren't good enough, or we need to strive to become more like Christ. The reality is, I'm hanging on to the end. I just say, God, help me be faithful, be steadfast, unmovable. Help me to abound in the work of the Lord and not get discouraged, knowing that my labors will be rewarded one day. But we have to make that very, very clear, or else people go on these wild goose chases of personal purity and morality, and they find themselves failing at it over and over again. See, I always put the emphasis about reading the Bible every day. You need to read the Bible, start every day with the Bible. And I believe that, and to the best of my ability, I try to do that. But I find that sometimes things come in and interrupt the process. And I have to stop what I'm doing and go take care of that situation. And many times, then I never get back to the Word, which is, again, one of my arguments for finding a time that is really pretty immune to that kind of interruption. But it's not completely true. So if you miss a day, does that mean that you failed? No, it just means tomorrow you need to pick it up. And you just keep on picking up every time you drop it. It's what you do over a long period of time that makes a difference. And the whole idea of reading the Bible every day isn't so that I can get saved. It's so that I can help weed out the garden of my soul. Remember the parable of the sower where the good seed fell on the ground, it sprouted up, and then it got choked off by the cares of affairs, the deceitfulness of riches, the pleasures of this world, and so forth, creeping in. I call those the weeds of life. And when I read the Bible every day, I feel like I'm going in and I'm pulling those weeds out before they get a chance to become rooted and become a bigger challenge to get rid of than they are in the beginning. So it's one of those things. It's keeping your accounts close. You know, you don't run a big tab. You don't go into debt. You don't want to be in moral debt with people. You want to be you don't want to be in spiritual debt with God. You want to keep all of your accounts current. But he says, we saw this splendor. And then he adds to this in verse 17. He says, he received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, this is my son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. And he says, we ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven. Now, the first question you might ask is, when did that happen? Well, it really happened within the last few months of Jesus' public ministry. Most people aren't familiar with the chronology of the Gospels because they're not easy to untangle. But one of the things that I found when I began to take that as a challenge is that for the first 2.5 years of Jesus' public ministry, he was primarily in the region of Galilee around Capernaum. He went to all the towns and villages, both in Galilee and Judea. He went up to Jerusalem for the feasts on a regular basis, probably more than we have record of. But what he did the last 6 months of his public ministry was not to go public. He withdrew from the disciples. He started going to places like modern-day Lebanon, where he met the Syrophoenician woman whose daughter had a demon that he cast out. Remember, she said, Lord, the puppies eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And he also went on the other direction, up and towards what we call Caesarea Philippi. Today, it's in what's called the Golan Heights in Israel, but it was outside of Israel in that day, outside of Judah, and was a Gentile city in the area controlled more by Syria than it was by Syria, not by Judea or any of those other areas. So he took them to these places where the Jewish population was relatively small, and that's when he was transfigured on a mountaintop. Remember that story. It's listed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all talking about the transformation of Jesus, or transfiguration, where he went, it says he went up into the sacred mountain, and there he was changed. Suddenly he was in glowing white robes. He had, the firmament all around him. And there was also Elijah, the prophet, and Moses, the founder, the lawgiver, side by side. And they're having this conversation. Remember what Peter did? He said, Lord, it's good for us to be here because we can build a tabernacle for each of you. And suddenly they're gone. And the voice from heaven says, this is my beloved son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. And then he adds, listen to him. I remember Gail Irwin said to me one time that oftentimes he says to Roman Catholics who are pretty engaged with Mary, really hold her in high esteem, he said we should always do the thing that Mary said, the very last words we have in the Bible that ever came from Mary. And what were those words? She said, do whatever he says. Remember, he turned the water into wine, and he told whatever he tells you to do, you do it. And so that's the last words of Mary, and I think it should be the first and foremost words in our life, that Mary was used by God. She was a great woman of faith, and what an honor she had. But she died like the rest of us. She wasn't assumed into heaven as the teaching goes, but rather she died and was buried. And her last words were, listen to Jesus, because he's the way, the truth, and the life. So that's the event he's talking about, is the transformation or transfiguration, and it's recorded, I said, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in very similar detail. But that's kind of the basis of how that came together. And it was that moment that we find that those three apostles in particular, Peter, John, and James, really realized who Jesus was, that he is not just a man, but he is in a position much higher. And what God was saying to them is, Moses brought you the law, but you won't get saved by following the law. Elijah represents the prophets, and you won't get saved by reading the prophets, but you will get saved by listening to what Jesus said and following him. Hope that made sense. Went through it pretty quick. Well, we'll pick it up tomorrow. God bless you.